The Novelist is an indie game released for the PC in 2013 by Kent Hudson, by way of his company, Orthogonal Games. It's a sort of explorative story game about the Kaplans, a family that's taking a summer vacation in a secluded beach house. There's Dan, a career writer struggling for inspiration on his next novel, Linda, who gave up her career when their son was born and wants to get back to her art full-time, and Tommy, their young son who just wants to play and spend time with his parents. But you don't play as any of the Kaplans. Instead, you play a ghost haunting their vacation house. Not a malicious ghost, but more like a curious one. As the summer goes on, the three Kaplans will each have things they want. The player's goal is to explore the house to find items and memories that imply what each of the characters wants to do, then choose one of the three people to get what they want on each day. If you figure out what anyone else wants, the player can also choose to give them a compromise, but one of the three, no matter what, will not have their wishes met for that day. The premise is an interesting and unique one that promises some interesting choices and interaction, and the novelist delivers on that in an imperfect but nonetheless fairly compelling way. The core of the game comes down to exploring the house and finding various things, be they letters written to friends of the Kaplans, personal thoughts written down by one of the characters, or a drawing Tommy made in crayon that hinted what the characters want. You can also possess a character to search the house for memories that also serve as clues. Once you've uncovered all the clues, you can choose which character gets what they want. Then there's a brief segment each night while the Kaplans are sleeping, where you can find various writings from previous owners and guests of the house that reveal a bit about how your ghost has interacted with others in the past. That last bit is a neat touch, though it doesn't honestly add much to the experience. The game is at its best while it's exploring the lives of the Kaplans, not the past exploits of your self-insert ghost character. In terms of gameplay, The Novelist is most similar to the kinds of narrative-based exploration games that are usually derided as walking simulators, but it does have a twist on that formula. The player can be seen by the Kaplans if they aren't careful, and getting seen too many times will make them suspicious and ruin the player's plans. So the player has to move about, primarily by possessing the lights in the house and moving from light to light without being seen. But to get all the clues, the ghost will occasionally need to walk freely to reach a certain clue or look into the memories of one of the Kaplans, so in that way it's more like a stealth game. That said, it has the option to remove that element entirely, so the Kaplans can't see you and there's no need to sneak around, and frankly, I think that's the better way to play. I know there's a general idea that a game needs gameplay to be any good, but good games aren't made by a checklist. The Novelist's primary goal is to present a story in which the player contributes to a number of difficult decisions that affect the outcome of a family's struggle for happiness. Things that contribute to that goal make the game better, things that detract from it make the game worse. And sitting around in a lamp waiting for Linda to leave the room so you can sneak up and take a peek at Tommy's memories does not help that goal. It just wastes time. So for what it's worth, I'd say it's better to turn the stealth mechanics off. The game does make fairly good use of space. The summer house is a relatively small place for the game to take place entirely in, and this isn't a bad thing at all. It's an intimate setting that the player comes to know very well, and that's a valuable thing that far too few games appreciate since we started focusing more on sprawling landscapes and large open areas. But it does also have the unfortunate side effect of making each new day feel more and more routine, especially if you're playing with the stealth gameplay, and while the characters generally feel quite alive, that illusion starts to crumble if you spend too much time watching them go back and forth between a few activities for too long while you wait for one of them to turn their back. These kinds of narrative adventure games are relatively common now, but between the fact that this was made in 2013, which for reference was the same year as Gone Home, and the specific nature of its storytelling ambitions, it's a rather bold experiment in some ways. Deeply human stories can be difficult to tell in video games, since there's usually so much pressure to include traditionally game-like elements, and the complexities of human interaction rarely fit within the limits of such design. The Novelist's attempt to work around this puts the character's wants, needs, and feelings out of the player's reach. You're not deciding how any of these characters feel, or what they do, or how they respond to anything, really, just which of their feelings and actions come to fruition. No compromise will be perfect, no solution will make everything turn out great. And in concept, this works. Often in practice, too. It's a novel way to allow for complex character work while still giving the player choices to consider and outcomes to influence, and at its best, those choices and outcomes can be quite compelling. The characters are, in some ways, fairly stereotypical. The man struggling to balance his career and family, the mother who gave up her career to raise a child, the kid who, well, really just wants to have fun and be loved. I mean, he's like 5, what do you want from him? Hudson is a good enough writer that the characters generally come across as fairly believable, and their struggles are mostly relatable. In seeing the specific things they go through week by week, we get deeper into what makes them tick than the broad strokes of their character archetypes. For the most part. Linda in particular suffers here. Her story is a little more interesting than it might appear because she's actually past the whole woman who gives up her career to raise a child phase and is in fact wanting to get back into her work as an artist now that Tommy is growing up. It's enough to make her more interesting, but the whole woman who has to choose between her child and her life thing is overplayed and stereotypical enough that her story never fully gets out from under its shadow, especially since, in my ending at least, I made a choice that impacts her greatly, but the only mention of her in the epilogue was about her marriage, not the choice I made. I think some other endings make more specific mention of her choices, but still, that seemed a little off. Now, usually, the whole system of one person getting what they want, another getting a compromise, and another not getting it at all works pretty well and makes sense. There's usually a logical reason why not everyone can have everything, be it the way multiple desires conflict, or simply a matter of time or financial constraints. Some even reach to more complex issues, like whether Dan will drink less because Linda's concerned about him, or continue drinking to inspire his writing. Issues like that speak to more than simply who gets what they want, and have potentially far-reaching consequences that could be good or bad regardless of whether a person's getting what they want. But sometimes the game still runs the issue of the resolutions being a little too binary. You know those scenarios in some movies where you feel like if the characters just talked to each other, a conclusion could easily be reached that meets everyone's needs? The writing in this game isn't poor enough to have that kind of false conflict, but the need for each person to have one of the three outcomes, fulfillment, compromise, or disappointment, sometimes feels like it came at the cost of a more effective resolution to a given issue the family was facing, or one of the solutions actually provided a relatively effective resolution to one of the other characters' desires, but that wasn't reflected because only one of them can get what they want. A few times I definitely felt that there could be a way to make things turn out better than the game would let them, but of course that wasn't an option, and it didn't always feel like that was with narrative justification. It sounds like I'm being super down on the game, and I'm not meaning to be. It's a real interesting narrative experiment that plays with character development and conflict in ways few games do, and honestly I'd say it's worth checking out for that reason alone. I think it just comes up against the limitations of its format on more than one occasion, and personally it kind of took me out of it. Though honestly, part of me would argue that's not entirely the game's fault. Obviously, I try to come at a game objectively when I review it, not to remove my opinion or perspective, but for the sake of seeing past it to recognize what does or doesn't work regardless of my own preferences. But my narrative engagement with the story only went so far as recognizing the difficult and complex problems this family faced, and I know from a good deal of other writing on The Novelist that it had a far more personal and deeply felt impact on people who related more strongly to the things these characters were going through. I mean, I'm not a father, and my life goals are fairly compatible with those of my wife. Like, overall, I just haven't found myself in a life situation analogous to the one I'm trying to help the Kaplans navigate in this game. Half the time I found myself ignoring Tommy's desires because, frankly, a kid wanting to fly a kite seems unimportant next to the success of Dan's book or Linda's art show, and I think I'm missing some key parental perspective there. It's easy to think a character or scenario doesn't fully make sense when viewing it from the outside, and I honestly think I would have gotten a lot more out of this game if I had a bit more life experience that related to the situations it showed me. Is that a narrative weakness on the game's part? Maybe. I mean, theoretically, a good story should be able to make you relate to the characters' struggles no matter how foreign they are to you. But at the same time, I don't think every story has to be made for every person. And as much as I have plenty of little issues where I don't think The Novelist fully came together, or I feel it met with the shortcomings of its experimental format, I also think it deserves credit, not only for trying what it did and succeeding with as much of it as it did, but addressing some complex human issues in a way that seems to speak very effectively into the lives of people who related to them, even if I personally didn't. So in Games as Lit 101, The Novelist gets a B-. It may not really be for me, and it definitely has problems, but I still think it's worth the time and money for people interested in interactive storytelling, and especially those who will relate to these characters. Thanks for watching. The Novelist was purchased for me by Wes Selkin, who's working on a more ambitious sequel to his game, One Screen Hero. Link to the original is in the description if you'd like to check out his work. If there are any released or upcoming games you'd like to purchase for me to review and plug something for you, email me at gamesasliterature@gmail.com and we can discuss it. See you next time.